March 21st, 1945, Berlin, Germany. The city shook like an old machine coming apart. Every few minutes, distant artillery rolled across the streets and rattled the windows of the Reich Chancellery. Smoke drifted low along Wilhelmstrasse, turning the early morning light into a gray, lifeless haze. Winter cold still clung to the stone buildings, but there was a fever in the air, a frantic energy that touched every corridor and every man who walked them. Deep beneath the ground, protected by meters of concrete, a single room glowed under a dim lamp. The shadows on the walls quivered with each explosion outside. This was the private study connected to the deeper bunker system, the place where Adolf Hitler wrote his final orders as the war closed in on every side. Papers covered the desk. Maps curled at the edges from the heat of a nearby stove. A cup of untouched tea sat beside a small fountain pen. And in the center of that desk, resting on a black folder marked confidential in German, was a blank sheet of paper that would become one of the strangest and most disputed documents of the entire war. Hitler leaned forward, the lamplight catching the tremor in his hand. His eyes, once sharp with confidence, looked sunken and strained. The war had aged him far beyond his years. He knew the collapse of the Reich was close, but he also believed that a final blow, a final idea, might still shape the future. He spoke quietly under his breath as he wrote, as if his own voice steadied his hand. The pen scratched across the page. The room grew heavy with silence. Outside, 2 guards stood at the door, shifting nervously with each vibration from above. The bunker had become a dark world of suspicion, whispers, and fear. No one knew who would be purged next. No one knew which orders would be followed or ignored. But inside the study, one man knew exactly what he was creating. A message, a warning, a proposal, perhaps even a threat. And it was not meant for any German official. It was meant for the President of the United States of America. When Hitler finished writing, he lifted the page and held it close to the lamp. His handwriting was unmistakable, jagged, tight, pressed hard into the paper. He read the lines again, especially the final sentences referring to a demonstration in Thuringia, and nodded once. To him, this letter represented something that could change the direction of history, even in the final hours. He placed it inside a manila envelope stamped confidential and pressed his personal seal on the flap. Then he called for the courier. The courier, a young officer named Jacob Weiss, entered the room trying to hide how much his hand shook. He had carried messages before, but nothing from this deep chamber, nothing that looked so official, nothing that bore the personal seal of the leader himself. Weiss bowed his head slightly as Hitler handed him the envelope. "You will deliver this to the Field Communications Office immediately," Hitler said. "They will know the rest." Weiss nodded, tucked the envelope carefully inside his leather pouch, and turned to leave. But as he reached the doorway, Hitler spoke again, his voice lower, almost weary. "No one must see it except the intended channel." Weiss swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The room fell silent again as the door closed behind him. Weiss moved through the bunker halls, passing officers whose eyes told stories of sleepless nights and rising terror. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Somewhere deeper below, workers hurried to relocate documents and personal belongings, desperate to keep whatever dignity they could as the enemy drew closer. When Weiss reached the communications office, he followed strict procedures. The envelope was logged, inspected visually without opening, and placed inside a larger sealed packet marked Special Channel. The German words for Special Channel to North America were stamped on the front. Sonderkanal Nordamerika. That was unusual. Almost nothing had moved along that channel since 1941. Weiss wondered why this letter mattered now, when the war was nearly lost. Outside, when Weiss stepped into the cold morning air, Berlin felt like a city already half destroyed. Smoke rose from entire neighborhoods. Windows blew open with each new bombardment. Civilians hurried across streets with bundles of belongings. Somewhere, a fire engine screamed, but never reached its destination. The courier climbed into the back of a staff car that would take him to the Express Transport Division. His breath fogged the window as he looked out at the ruined city. He wondered what could possibly be written in that envelope. Why send a letter to the American president now? Why deliver it through a channel that was supposedly closed years ago? The car jerked as the driver shifted gears, and the vehicle turned toward the outskirts of the city. They passed a group of Volkssturm militia, old men carrying bolt-action rifles, boys wearing helmets too big for their heads. Their faces were pale, as if they already knew their fate. At a checkpoint, an SS officer stopped the car. He checked the driver first, then turned his attention to Weiss. Weiss handed him his papers, trying to appear calm. The officer studied them, glanced at the leather pouch on Weiss's belt, and narrowed his eyes. "What is your destination?" the officer asked. "Express Transport Division," Weiss said. "Urgent dispatch." The officer hesitated, then nodded slowly and waved them through. But Weiss could feel his eyes on him until the car rounded the corner. Everyone distrusted everyone in the final days of the Reich. That was the reality. They drove for almost an hour through the ruined outskirts of Berlin until they reached a small military airstrip. Half of it had been cratered by bombings. The remaining runway was scattered with debris. A few workers cleared rubble with shovels, knowing airplanes might not land safely again. Against the gray sky, the silhouette of a small transport plane sat idling. Weiss hurried across the tarmac. The wind cut through his coat. The engines of the transport aircraft roared, making conversation impossible. He handed the sealed packet to the flight officer, who inspected it, nodded, and loaded it among secure dispatch items in the cockpit. As Weiss stepped away from the plane, he felt a strange heaviness settle inside him. Something was different about this assignment. He sensed it in the way the officers handled the envelope, in the secrecy surrounding it, in the quiet urgency of the moment. It was as if this single sheet of paper carried a weight greater than anything he had delivered before. He turned to leave the airstrip, but the sky suddenly lit up with flashes of distant explosions. Artillery fire approached again. The ground trembled beneath his boots. The pilot shouted at the crew to hurry. Weiss took one last look at the transport plane, then began running toward the shelter. He never made it. A shell exploded near the runway, knocking him to the ground. His ears rang. Smoke filled the air. When he looked up, the transport plane was already rolling forward, kicking up dust as it accelerated. Weiss struggled to his feet, coughing, and watched as the aircraft lifted clumsily into the smoky sky. The envelope containing the letter he had been entrusted with was now leaving Berlin, but fate was not finished with it. The plane headed west toward temporary German-controlled territory. But within hours, Allied fighter patrols were sweeping the sky. The transport crew tried to evade detection by staying low. They dodged clouds of flak and streaks of tracer rounds. They descended sharply through pockets of turbulence. But then near the region of Kassel as evening approached, American units advanced faster than Berlin expected. The plane never reached its destination. A crash report later filed by American intelligence described a small German transport aircraft forced down in heavy forest. The pilot survived. The co-pilot survived. The dispatch compartment burst open on impact, scattering its contents into the underbrush. A U.S. patrol reached the wreck within minutes, and somewhere in that forest, under broken branches and soft earth, American hands lifted the sealed envelope marked Special Channel North America. The letter was no longer in German custody, and no one in Berlin would ever see it again. March 22, 1945, Washington, D.C. The air inside the map room of the White House carried the faint smell of paper, ink, and tired men. Dozens of colored pins marked troop movements across Europe. New reports arrived every hour. Staff officers moved quickly between desks, whispering updates, adjusting positions, calculating supply lines and casualties. The war was entering its final stage, yet the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. A single envelope had changed the rhythm of the room. It sat on a polished wooden table, still streaked with dirt and fragments of dried mud from the German forest where American soldiers had recovered it. The label remained clear. Sonderkanal North America. Special Channel North America. Confidential. No one present had seen that designation in years. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered slowly, leaning slightly on an aide. His face was pale, his shoulders thinner, his movements deliberate. The war and his failing health were working together, draining his strength day by day. But his mind still moved with the same sharp precision that carried the nation through depression, a global conflict, and endless nights of decision. The intelligence officer stepped forward and briefed him quickly. A downed German transport east of Kassel. Surviving crew captured. Dispatch bags recovered. Among them was this envelope, sealed intact, bearing markings that suggested diplomatic intent. Roosevelt reached for it, his hand trembling slightly, but his eyes steady. He opened the flap and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting struck him immediately, clenched and forceful, almost carved into surface. The ink spread unevenly in places where the writer pressed too hard. Roosevelt began reading, his brow tightening line by line. His aides watched from a careful distance, sensing the tension in the room shift. The document read, "To the President of the United States, the conflict between our nations has reached a point from which there will be no return unless reason prevails. I address you not as adversary, but as the leader of a people who, like my own, face the consequences of total war. Germany retains a strategic instrument not yet revealed to the world. It is the result of scientific progress pursued under extreme pressure, and it possesses the ability to alter the balance of power in hours, not months. You may dismiss this as exaggeration, yet the demonstration in the Thuringia region will confirm what I state here. Your advisors will assure you that Germany has been defeated. They believe our armies are exhausted and our resources broken. Yet not all strength lies in what is visible. There are developments that are not known even to many within my own government. Consider what a continued conflict will bring. Consider the destruction that will follow. If the United States insists on unconditional surrender, the consequences of that policy will not be confined to Europe alone. I propose a final arrangement, one that acknowledges the realities of the present moment. It is still possible to reshape the future in a way that preserves stability for both our nations. Delay in considering this message will force actions from which neither side will benefit. I expect your response through the established channel." A Hitler. Roosevelt lowered the page slowly, and for a moment the room seemed to stop breathing. The implications were enormous. A strategic instrument that could alter the balance of power in hours. A threat of a demonstration in Thuringia. A final arrangement. No mention of surrender. No admission of defeat. Instead, an unsettling combination of warning, invitation, and desperation. The president read the letter again. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. The words were crafted not for negotiation, but for psychological pressure. Hitler wanted him to believe Germany still held some undisclosed power. He wanted the United States to hesitate. He wanted the idea of a German scientific breakthrough to take root in Roosevelt's mind. Roosevelt turned toward the map of Germany on the wall. He traced the region of Thuringia with his eyes, a place of forests, hills, and scattered industrial sites. Allied intelligence had reported unusual activity there. Soviet reports hinted at a strange explosion. No confirmation existed, but now the letter tied those fragments together. He asked for all available intelligence on Thuringia. Officers scrambled to gather intercepted signals, field notes, and reconnaissance summaries. The reports came back incomplete, contradictory, confusing. Some mentioned vibrations felt in nearby villages. Others described military convoys moving at night. A few hinted at underground facilities. Nothing pointed to certainty. Everything pointed to suspicion. Roosevelt folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. His movements were slow and heavy. He knew he could not release this information to the public. Panic would spread. The fragile unity of the Allies could crack. Rumors of a secret German weapon would ignite fear across the world. His voice came quiet but firm. Restricted handling. No public reference. Further analysis required. The envelope returned to the secure file, its fate now tied to the fragile health of the man who had read it. The days that followed blurred together. Roosevelt worked through exhaustion. Photographers captured images of a smiling leader, but those close to him saw the truth. The weight of war had worn him down. His doctor urged him to rest. He ignored the advice. He believed the end of the conflict needed him. He believed there were decisions only he could make. On the morning of April 12th, while sitting for a portrait at Warm Springs, Roosevelt pressed his hand to his forehead and whispered that he had a terrible headache. Moments later, he collapsed. By that afternoon, he was gone. Across the United States, radios fell silent before crackling with the announcement. Millions cried. Some prayed. Some could not believe what they heard. Behind the scenes, chaos moved quickly. Files needed securing. Communications needed transferring. Sensitive documents needed to be sealed. Among those papers was the envelope containing Hitler's letter. It did not remain forgotten. Later, in his first week as president, Harry S. Truman was ushered into a secure briefing room. The table before him held the documents Roosevelt had been reviewing: reports from Europe, Pacific War summaries, pending diplomatic communications, nuclear research updates, intelligence fragments on German scientific programs. And near the top of the stack, the envelope, Sonderkanal, North America. Truman opened it. He read the letter twice. His expression changed slowly, from confusion to concern, from concern to something deeper. He asked his advisors what Roosevelt had thought of it. They could not answer. Roosevelt had left no written comment, no memorandum, no note indicating his reaction. Truman stared at the final paragraph again. The line warning of consequences if the United States demanded unconditional surrender. He knew the war was close to ending, but he also knew Germany had grown desperate. Desperate nations made dangerous choices. He ordered a restricted review and folded the letter back into the envelope. He wrote a small mark on the back so he could identify quickly if needed. A simple signature, HST. The letter remained in government custody, but its meaning stayed uncertain, unconfirmed, and unresolved. In 1997, decades after the war had ended, Klaus Reinhardt stood alone in a Berlin archive and held the empty envelope in his hands. He traced the faded seal impression with his thumb. He examined the faint American notations. He turned it over and saw the initials, HST, a signature belonging to a man who had read the letter more than half a century earlier. A signature that should not have remained on a document stored in a foreign archive. The envelope was empty. The letter was gone, and whatever Roosevelt and Truman had feared within those words remained known only to the few people who had read them. Reinhardt stared at the empty space inside the envelope, the air thick with the weight of unanswered questions. The letter had existed. The message had been delivered. The warning had been issued. But the world never learned what happened next. And someone somewhere had decided to ensure it stayed that way. October 5th, 1997, Berlin, Germany. A late afternoon sun cast long slanted beams through the dusty windows of the German Federal Military Archive, illuminating the narrow aisles between towering shelves of classified wartime material. Folders thousands of pages thick were stacked in rows, their edges yellowed with age. Some had not been opened in more than 50 years. Klaus Reinhardt stood alone at a wooden table in the center of the room. His hands rested on a gray archival box. The words collapsed, bunker material typed neatly on a label. He had spent the last week combing through the scattered remains of documents recovered from Hitler's final Berlin command centers. Most of them were routine administrative scraps. Some were worthless, but a few held secrets no historian had ever fully explained. Inside the box, beneath torn ration lists and burned memos, he found the envelope again. It looked more fragile this time. The edges had softened. The paper carried the faint smell of smoke from the bunker where it had been found. The red wax-like seal had crumbled away, yet the words on the front remained perfectly legible. Sonderkanal, North America. Special Channel, North America. He lifted the envelope carefully, turning it over under the light. The faint notation that American officers had added was still visible. And there, just above the fold, were the pencil initials he had studied several times already. HST. He knew the meaning of those initials. Every historian did. But seeing them on a German envelope from 1945 felt unreal, as if history had accidentally left a signature it never planned to reveal. Truman had held this envelope in his hands. He had read what was inside. He had chosen silence. Reinhardt placed the envelope gently on the table and looked at the empty interior again. The letter was missing. The most important part was gone. He had checked every archive room. He had searched cross-reference files. He had contacted American repositories. He had even reviewed Soviet transfer lists. The letter had vanished completely, yet the envelope remained. He knew what that meant. Someone had removed the letter long after the war. Someone who understood the significance of its contents. Someone who wanted the world to know the envelope existed, but not the message itself. He sat down slowly, the weight of the discovery settling around him. He reached for the folder containing the American salvage report from the crash site near Kassel. The paper was brittle, but the ink could still be read. It described the capture of the transport crew and the collection of dispatch materials. One line caught his attention every time. Packet identified. Forward to W.H. Washington. Roosevelt had received it. That fact alone would reshape entire timelines of diplomatic history. But the second part of the report was even more disturbing. It mentioned the courier briefly, then offered no additional details. The section that should have explained what happened next had been crossed out so deeply that the pen had nearly torn through the page. Reinhardt leaned closer, tracing the indentation from the pen that wrote it 50 years earlier. He could make out one faint phrase beneath the cross line. The courier was not transported. That was all. No explanation. No location. No name. Reinhardt sat back and stared at the stacks of documents surrounding him. The silence of the room felt different now. It carried the weight of decisions made long before he was born. Decisions that shaped the outcome of the war and were now buried beneath layers of secrecy. He opened a notebook and reread his own summary of the reconstructed letter. The words Hitler had written to Roosevelt still sent a chill through him. A strategic instrument not yet revealed to the world. A demonstration in Thuringia to prove its capability. A warning that an insistence on unconditional surrender would have consequences beyond Europe. A suggestion of a final arrangement to reshape the future. A promise that delay would force actions neither side would benefit from. He looked up at the dim ceiling. Lights. If Germany had such a weapon, why had it not been used? If Hitler believed in it so strongly, why was the war lost weeks later? If the demonstration in Thuringia truly occurred, why had almost no trace of it survived? Why had both Roosevelt and Truman kept the letter hidden? He knew the public explanations for the war's end. Allied strength, German collapse, strategic superiority. But this letter added another layer, one no official narrative acknowledged. He wondered whether Roosevelt had believed the threat, whether Truman had feared the possibility, whether American scientists had been pressured by the letter's implications during the race to finish their own weapon, whether the Allies had found something in Thuringia, after all, something that could justify burying the truth. He could not answer any of those questions. No one could. The letter was gone. Only the envelope remained like a silent witness. Klaus Reinhardt placed it back in the archival box and slowly closed the lid. He signed the return slip and handed the box to the archivist at the front desk. She smiled politely, unaware of what the box contained. As he walked out of the archive building, the autumn wind carried a soft chill. Leaves rustled across the pavement. The sky deepened into a pale gold. He paused at the top of the steps and looked back once, as if hoping to see the truth appear behind one of the old windows. It never did. Some secrets resist daylight. Some documents vanish for reasons no file can explain. And some stories balance forever between what is known and what is feared. The letter from Hitler to the President of the United States was one of them. He crossed the courtyard and disappeared through the gates. The envelope remained behind him in the archives, waiting quietly for someone else to follow its trail. What the letter truly meant, why two presidents had hidden it, and who removed it from the file, remained questions that history still could not answer. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps some truths were never meant to be discovered. If stories like this remind you how many secrets of the war still lie buried, take a moment to support the channel. Please share this video so others can join the investigation into history's forgotten files. Leave a like, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files, so you never miss a chapter of history the world tried to hide. I read every comment, and this community means the world to me.